Okay, we start with the job description. You're told that you are a financial manager with Aurora Automotive Company. So we're going to refer to them as Aurora from now on for short. And you're reporting to Jens Snyder, who is a senior financial manager at the company, who in turn reports to the finance director. We'll see the organization chart later on. The finance director is this person, Lim Yi. So you're likely to be interacting, of course, with Jens on exam day, and very probably as well, you're likely to be reporting to his boss, Lim Yi. So your primary responsibility is management accounting. But you're told also that you're actually going to be liaising with colleagues from a variety of areas such as treasury and financial reporting, sales, HR, and operations. So you can expect at the management level a wider range of interactions than you encountered at the operational level. At the operational level, you were more confined to discussions with finance colleagues. You could assume a certain level of financial jargon was acceptable with those colleagues. You didn't have to explain those terms to them. But at this level, a little bit of care needs to be taken not to assume financial knowledge when you're dealing with a sales counterpart or a HR person or an operational member of staff. So you might need to unpack some of the financial terms that you would use with a short description of what it is. So because we're dealing with a very traditional, a classic production line in the form of car manufacturing, you can think of this as offering the template for the modern factory with its emphasis on cost control, high quality, efficiency, etc. It's going to be the case that management accounting in this kind of environment plays a very crucial role. You think then that your P2 studies are going to come to influence this case quite significantly. And we're going to be discussing different P2 issues throughout this particular pre-scene. And here are some of the main ones that are going to come up. Managing costs is going to be important. You think of activity-based costing versus more traditional forms of absorption costing, and we'll see the impact, for example, that this more traditional approach to costing has on the perceived profitability of different vehicle models. Later on in the pre-scene, we have lots of costing information to talk through there. CPA, you remember this stands for Customer Profitability Analysis. That will come to bear perhaps on this case. Total quality management is really important for the car manufacturing industry in general, and it's mentioned specifically in this case. Quality is a big issue as well, and cost of quality. You're thinking about prevention costs, appraisal costs. The idea is that you are not passing on any errors, ideally to the end customer, that would hurt the reputation of the company. And the car industry in particular is very focused on high quality and getting things right the first time, which is an element of the total quality management. Just-in-time, and that philosophy is something that comes to bear very heavily on the car industry, and it's mentioned again specifically in this pre-scene. You think about the theory of constraints and identifying bottlenecks, and that being very important here, and again to the wider car manufacturing industry that's important too. Long-term profitability will be a consideration, of course, and here you're dealing with things like target costing. As I mentioned, the costing information, the extensive costing information we will see later on in this pre-scene. And I'm not sure they're taking a good approach to their costing per unit. The way that they're assigning their overhead costs is perhaps questionable, and there may be too high a proportion of those overhead costs being assigned to certain models, and this gives the impression they're less profitable than they actually are. So target costing could be an approach here where you are fixated on achieving a certain profit margin, and You have your selling price, so that gives you your target cost to aim at. It could be an approach worth looking at for Aurora. You think of the value chain and the importance of having a tight value chain, a well-controlled value chain and value system. You think about upstream and downstream players in the value system. You've got your suppliers of parts and your supplier of subcomponents being very important in this industry. And then at the other end of the chain, you have the distributors, and they are the car dealerships, which are standard in the car industry. So the tighter this system is, the more close the interactions, the closer the relationships, the better. And what we read later on in this industry, or in this pre-scene, is that in fact Aurora has been acquiring throughout its history various subsidiaries scattered throughout the value system. We're led to believe that they have part suppliers in-house, etc. Pricing strategy is going to be important as well. You think about the demand curve, establishing what the price elasticity is in this industry, whether there is sensitivity to price changes and how that would affect the way you set the price. Profit maximization considerations are important too. And finally, I would say transfer pricing is going to be a consideration when you are undoubtedly dealing with internal transfers of goods in the form of car parts and car subcomponents, for example. You're going to be dealing with transfer pricing as a key consideration. How do you set those transfer prices? How do you ensure that the company as a whole is being well served when those transfer prices are enacted? Are you incentivizing the right kind of behaviors? One department transferring to the other, they're going to want to be rewarded for the work that they do. If they're told, for example, no, you're transferring your parts just at cost, it might create perverse incentives where, they're not acting in the best interests of the company overall by, not putting their best foot forward. And that's a consideration for this particular case too. I want to discuss then the role of financial manager. And there are a few key considerations with all of these management case studies, and they tend to come up again and again. With the financial manager role, you're dealing with monitoring the implementation of strategy. At the strategic level and higher up the organizational chart, you're going to have people defining the strategy for the company over the next 3 to 5 years, for example, taking a long-term kind of a view. And you will be expected not to execute the strategy, but to oversee the execution of the strategy. At the operational level, you're dealing with execution on a day-to-day basis of the high-level strategy, whereas at the managerial level, you're talking about monitoring that strategy and the implementation of that strategy. Following on from this, you will have a mid-term focus as opposed to a short-term focus for OCS and a long-term focus for SCS. So you're talking about deciding on investments in certain products and their related prices being important. Risk is a key consideration at this level. You think of your P2 studies. It's not mentioned really very often throughout this particular pre-scene, but don't be surprised to see it come up on exam day. You think about ways to manage your risk. You think of the TARA model, for example, whether you transfer risk, accept it, reduce it, or avoid it altogether. Long-term financing is going to be a consideration too. You're dealing with considerations of long-term debt versus equity, for example, and what the best option is for financing various projects. You will have more advanced financial reporting standards to think about. You're going to have for sure things coming up on consolidation. This is a company with many subsidiaries, so you can expect group financial reporting. That's what we see in the financial statements indeed, and you see the impact there of non-controlling interests, etc., which we will talk about later on. You're talking as well here about influencing top management. You're likely to have a wider variety of colleagues contacting you. They're likely to be quite senior. You will have senior managers, directors across the company coming to you for advice on exam day, and it's important that you know how to influence these people. You're getting your point across. You're selling them a particular recommendation. So keep that in mind. And of course, you need to consider here the wider environment. You're talking about the wider competitive environment, the wider regulatory environment as well at this level. And relating to that, you're dealing with different stakeholders. So you're not just thinking about the stakeholders as they relate to the value system, your suppliers, your distributors, etc. But of course, they are a consideration at this level. But you'll be extending your discussions with stakeholders and your consideration of stakeholders to such players as bank lenders, government bodies, regulatory bodies, and people like that. And depending on those stakeholders' interest and their level of power, you're going to be taking different approaches to managing them. I want to reflect then on some of the key issues we've seen in the opening and the job description. And first of all, we talked about at the management level for the case study, you're talking about interactions with various departments, sales, HR, as well as finance. So you should expect to hear from a number of different colleagues on exam day when it comes to the exam triggers. And we talked about the importance of not assuming financial knowledge. So you need to unpack your financial jargon a little bit and explain what some of the technical terms might mean. You also need to be able to influence these people because you're going to be dealing with people higher up the food chain, so to speak. We saw as well that P2 is very prominent in this particular case. We're talking about the car manufacturing industry. It's a template for the modern production facilities. And it's very fixated on cost, efficiency, and the issues surrounding quality. And of course, management accounting is an ideal tool for dealing with many of those concerns. So you also need to bear in mind at this level that you've got a midterm focus as a manager. You're going to be the one monitoring the execution of the strategy that's set out by the senior management team. And we talked about some of the key considerations at this level. Risk, more advanced financial reporting standards, particularly I think consolidation is going to be an issue here, given the fact that Aurora has so many subsidiaries worldwide. You're going to have transfer pricing issues there when you've got so many intragroup transactions, etc. So certainly P2 is prominent in this particular case. Okay, we're now looking at a brief history of the automotive industry, starting in the early part of the 20th century and coming through to the present day. And what we're told in the very first paragraph is that the automotive industry has always been at the forefront of technological developments in both manufacturing and indeed with relation to commercial business practices. So they've led the development of automated manufacturing processes, and they've been at the forefront of globalization, again relating to both manufacturing and marketing. So when we refer to globalization, what we're principally talking about here is the interdependence of countries, increased trade between those countries, increased capital flows, and the rapid diffusion of technology. So they're all big elements of globalization. The automotive industry has been at the very heart of that push over the last 20 to 30 years. When we go back to that first line, it's talking about the technological developments, and that is certainly true. Automotive companies are amongst the biggest spenders in the world in research and development, for example, and indeed the very biggest spender in the corporate world when it comes to research and development is the Volkswagen Group, who I'm sure you are very familiar with. Then it's quite well known, of course, that the automobile industry is really fixated on its manufacturing process, on high quality, on efficiency, etc. What's perhaps less spoken about is the need to be world-class when it comes to marketing as well. You think about it, that these cars, they are big ticket items. Besides a house, it represents, the sale of a car represents the biggest expenditure that the average person is likely to make in their lifetimes. So it's really important that the marketing is right. It's also very important to adapt the marketing message depending on the different cultures. And as we will see in a while, marketing for these companies is worldwide, and they're dealing with many, many, many different markets, so they need that adaptability to those markets. Moving on then, what we see is the start of this overview of the 20th century and the different practices of the automobile industry. So, the start of the 20th century, when the industry first came into existence, it was really heavily dependent on skilled labor. But that approach actually gave way very quickly to production lines to improve efficiency and costs. Okay. So we think there about the assembly line, and of course the most famous early exponent of that is Henry Ford and his company Ford, which persists today as well. So he was responsible for the assembly line with a great degree of specialization. People were set up along the assembly line, and they had one small task to focus on in a group of many, many, many different tasks, and they had to do that well. And there was, let's say, a learning curve effect. As they got better and better and better, the price and the cost per unit of each car made would come down. So that degree of specialization and that assembly line setup really lowered costs. And this is a focus, it has been a focus all through the history of the automotive industry, that there's a fixation on lowering costs, and the way they do it is through improved efficiency. Okay, so we're told then that each worker would fit a specific component of each car that passed on the production line on a repetitive basis. So that is a little bit the one of the drawbacks of these assembly lines, is that they're quite repetitive. The work can be quite dull. We'll see in a while though that a lot of the heavy lifting and a lot of those dull repetitive tasks are now being outsourced to robotics, and that is an interesting development which we'll look at shortly. Okay, then moving on to the next section, and we see that the introduction of more efficient production methods, it reduced costs, as we said before, and that was important because prices could be lowered, and of course that gave automobile makers access to the mass market. Okay, so the industry really took off then. It wasn't just a case of churning out a few vehicles every couple of months or every year that were dependent on very, very skilled labor. No, the assembly line had been set up, and these things were being produced by the thousands, okay, on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. Okay, so we're told about how the fact that the industry really grew from there to become a dominant economic force in many countries. And we're told then a little bit about the complexity of making a car, thousands of components, okay? And many businesses then spring up to supply the major car makers with parts and materials. So these suppliers are part of the value system, and the value system needs to be very, very well managed for the automobile industry, and needs to be quite tight. There need to be good relations with suppliers. They need to be depended upon to ensure that the right parts are getting to the factories at the right times, that there's minimal inventory, and that the lead times are shorter. So interesting the way they refer then to the history of costs coming down, giving access to the mass market. And in fact, that is still occurring today when you think about what is happening with electric car models, with Tesla leading the way there. What they've been doing over the last few years is they've been achieving more economies of scale. They've been lowering the price of, for example, of their batteries, which are a crucial element in driving these cars. And with those costs coming down, they're finding that they're able to lower their prices and access the mass market. And Elon Musk, the famous CEO of Tesla, sees that as the future of the Tesla company being able to access that mass market to achieve critical mass. Okay, then we're told then that the early production lines, they were highly efficient, but the problem was they offered limited flexibility. Okay, and there was only really scope to produce the same version again and again and again. And you think about Henry Ford again, and he had that famous saying, he said that any color you wish to have, you can have, as long as it's black. Okay, so there was no customization or anything like that back then. That's where this leads us then to the latter part of the 20th century, where that does become a feature. Okay, latter part of the 20th century then, and what you're going to see again and again and again is that the big developments in the 20th century, again, all relate to costs, driving them down, cost reduction. And there's a little bit as well on robotics, which is, of course, a cost reducer, but it also helps with specialization. It counters that limited flexibility, in fact. But most of the developments we're going to see throughout the latter part of the 20th century deal with cost reduction. And how are you achieving those cost reductions? Well, there's a key term, economies of scale. You're going to see it again and again and again. So, firstly, there's a move towards modular component subsystems. So what are these? Well, there are specialist manufacturers springing up, and they're specializing in certain sub-assemblies. So they're taking many parts and they're combining them into these sub-components, these big sub-components you find in any car, such as engines, gearboxes, braking systems, etc. And what you've seen in recent years in the auto industry is to achieve economies of scale. There has been a consolidation of suppliers in this area. So the parts suppliers, the sub-assembly makers have consolidated in recent years. They need to achieve scale, and scale is so important when it comes to making the kinds of huge investments that are necessary in the auto industry, and also, of course, to lower unit costs, which get passed on then to the end consumer. So these items, we're told, are they're being mass produced, okay, in order to create those economies of scale. So that is a very key term when it comes to the auto industry, and we're going to see it come up again and again and again. There's been a shift away from wholly national car manufacturers, we're told, to a more global outlook. So this is the globalization part of the auto industry. So we're given an example. A European manufacturer, for example, might use a braking system imported from a manufacturer in Asia, and an audio system from a different manufacturer in the USA. So that's the first development, modular component subsystems, these sub-assemblies. The second big movement in the latter part of the 20th century are the sharing of common components across multiple models. Okay, so the example we're given here is, that the same floor pan, it can be developed into a family hatchback, small delivery van, a sports car as well. So across multiple models, you're using the same component there. And then you can mass produce these components. You can produce them in bulk, which will lower unit costs as well. And obviously, it's a great way to, again, achieve economies of scale. That term comes up again and again, as I've said before. And common components, we're told, are used in several different models of cars, thereby creating those economies of scale. It's also important to point out that in this area, there are now fewer setups necessary for different components. Imagine you have to use a different floor pan for each and every model. Well, then you would have to reset the machinery, the robotics, to produce the different component, and that would take time, and the time would add cost. Okay, then we're told a little bit more about this development, the sharing of common components, and what it means is as well. Another development is that collaborations between different manufacturers are much more commonplace, where you'll get two or more manufacturers. They actually collaborate on the development of some element of the car, such as engines and gearboxes, etc. They work together on that in the design and the manufacture, again achieving those key economies of scale because of the fact that they can produce those parts in bulk. They're going to be used by multiple manufacturers, so they're going to achieve cost savings there too. And it shows you the extent to which practicality drives this industry. It's practicality over rivalry, and that is a key development as well. And the final big movement in the latter part of the 20th century relates to the rise of robotics. And I made reference to this before, that a lot of the repetitive, mundane tasks are now automated due to these robotics. And also there's a greater degree of precision, okay, than when using human operators. Okay, so a couple of things to comment on here. First of all, the fact that the robotics, of course, will achieve not just cost benefits, okay, cost savings as the other developments have, but also the ability to customize, as we'll see. Greater flexibility is possible with the robotics. We're told in the next section that these robots can cope with different versions of the same basic car to be produced in a single run without interruption or retooling. Okay, so they have that adaptability. They can do that, and that is obviously going to aid customization. Okay, then as well, because of these robotics, of course, there are going to be big investments in setting up a modern day factory. And what that means is that you're going to have very high sunk costs. Okay, and of course, where you have very high sunk costs to get off the ground, it's going to create barriers to entry. So not just any company can move in and create automobiles, can manufacture automobiles. There are significant investments to be made, and of course, because of those significant investments, you have this trend of consolidation in recent times. There's more strength in numbers, so automobile companies are merging, part suppliers are merging, and that's something that will come up later in the pre-scene. Another point then about robotics and the need to invest in these robots. You think of your E2 studies, and you're talking there about asset specificity, okay? And you'll recall that this refers to assets that can't really be applied outside the particular industry, okay? So these assets are useful only to the auto industry. What happens if a company folds? It can't really sell those assets off. And as well, if there's a new development or something like that and the robots are deemed out of date, they can't just be sold off to purchase new robots, for example. So that creates a bit of a problem. And in fact, what it does as well is that it drives vertical integration and the growth of large organizations. You can imagine a world in which you had many automobile manufacturers, many parts suppliers. They alone, on their own, will not be able to make the kind of, or they won't be able to justify the big investments in these robotics if in a year's time they need to turn around, write them off completely and buy a whole new set of robots for their factories. So that is not possible. So there's going to be more consolidation, more vertical integration, bringing suppliers in under the umbrella of a car manufacturer. It's commonplace, and indeed we'll find out soon that Aurora does that too. So I talked about the fact that you have greater flexibility as well with the robots, and that leads to greater ability to customize vehicles, which is becoming ever more important, and it justifies as well offering vehicles for higher prices and aiding profitability. So they cope with different versions of the same car to be produced in a single run without interruption or retooling. We are told later on in the pre-scene, retooling is a significant cost for car manufacturers, and it involves having to stop the production to set the robots up in a different way, to give them new tools to adapt to new models and new specifications, etc. That need is being reduced with modern robotics. And also you think about this ability to offer greater flexibility. You think about your P2 studies and the costs in a modern manufacturing environment, and what you were led to believe is that with variety comes increasing cost. And what the robotics are doing is that they're actually countering this problem. It doesn't have to be a problem for car manufacturers anymore. They're able to produce volume plus variety, and they're able to keep those costs in check as well. So this is a really recent development in the auto industry. Okay, then we're told a little bit about how this greater flexibility is achieved, that each car is given a unique vehicle number, and it's tracked through the production line. And the various elements then are brought to the production line in automated sequences so they can be fitted out, and the system is able to cope with optional extras and different finishes. So for example, a customer, they could order an accessory that could be fitted on the production line, and the robots are programmed to actually select different parts as and when needed. So that's the beauty of modern robotics. They're very responsive, and they can adapt in a way in which car manufacturers were not able to adapt 20, 30 years ago. And then we're told a little bit about some of the philosophies that the automotive industry follows. We're told that they were an early adopter of advanced manufacturing techniques such as just-in-time and quality circles. So these are very, very important for this particular industry. We're going to see plenty of mention of just-in-time throughout this pre-scene. In fact, Aurora, we are told specifically, adheres to the just-in-time philosophy, and we'll talk about what that entails when we come to Aurora. You think about again your P2 studies, and continuous improvement being a big feature of the just-in-time approach. You're talking as well there about quality circles, and there you're dealing with empowered employees. They're coming together regularly, discussing problems and how they can solve those problems. And a lot of that came from Toyota in the 60s and 70s, where they adopted this approach to give great responsibility to their employees. They then expected them to achieve more, and indeed they did. If you empower people in that way, they can surprise you, and that's what Toyota found, and that's what the auto industry has found too with these quality circles. And it's an interesting point to consider, because what we're going to see later on is that there is a little bit of turbulence amongst the employees in the Aurora group. We're told that there's potential strike action coming up soon due to certain employees not following the rules, and it seems Aurora has come down very, very heavy on their employees, and I wonder would that upset morale. And the employees in a car manufacturer are a key asset, and if you're going to rock the boat, if you're going to upset them, come down hard on them, you're acting in a very authoritative way, which flies in the face of the more enlightened approach Toyota and these companies took to handing over more responsibility to their employees. We'll deal with that a little bit more later. A word then in just-in-time. There are some vulnerabilities to discuss there. And And one of them would be disruptions to supply. Just-in-time method means the car manufacturer is actually very vulnerable to that disruptions in the supply. And you'll know that just-in-time deals with short lead times, close relationships with suppliers, having the minimum inventory, minimum holding costs, and getting things right the first time so that defects are not passed along the line. But if there is a disruption to a supply, it means everything grinds to a halt because there's no inventory to stock of inventory to bring up to replace the missing parts. So that is one vulnerability for sure. And it's difficult perhaps to predict demand all the time. There will be lulls in demand and there will be peaks in demand. And it means that your demand prediction has to be very, very strong in order to ensure you're ordering the right number of parts from your suppliers. And then we're told, of course, that the industry has always placed a very high emphasis on economy and efficiency. And you may remember that economy and efficiency, well, economy deals with the cost of inputs primarily, and efficiency is all about converting inputs into outputs in a timely manner, in a cost-effective manner. Then in the next section, we're told about employees. It's funny, we haven't really spoken about employees very much so far, but they still have a place in the 21st century. And what we see is that there's still a need for them to interact often with the robotics. Often they're looking after the maintenance of robots and things like that. Someone needs to repair the machines, and occasionally there is a need for an employee or employees to step in when something surprising happens. So let's just take a look at where human operators come into play in the manufacturing process. Maintenance is one. And we're told that robots occasionally break down. It's not surprising. And then engineers are needed to repair the broken equipment. Production and control. Production lines can be reconfigured to produce more than one model, and that usually requires the line to be stopped and equipment reset manually. So this would be retooling. We're going to come up against that a little bit later on. That's quite a significant cost. Ideally, they're kept to a minimum by having longer production runs. Unanticipated events as well. So sometimes it's just quicker and more easy to get a person involved. An additional quality check, for example, can be handled more ably by a human being often. And final product inspection as well. Often it's more effective to conduct that visually. And then for complex tasks as well, it might actually be more cost effective to carry out certain tasks manually. And where that would be the case would be with low volume models. And you think there about sports cars, high-end luxury sports cars. And in fact, often buyers will value the fact that highly skilled workers spent additional time, polishing up these vehicles, these high-end luxury sports cars, and they don't mind that this adds cost. There's a premium they're willing to pay, and it's a prestige item. So you will find that still these luxury models there's a great degree of manual labor involved there. And then we're told that it's not just manufacturing that has changed in the 20th century, but also we're told that in the first half of the 20th century, while most countries had their own automotive industries and they catered to local tastes, this has started to change in recent times, in the last 20, 30 years, especially with globalization. Exports started to come from Asia. They exported very aggressively in the 70s and 80s, and they started to compete with local manufacturers in the United States and other big markets such as Europe. And what that did was, because the Asian manufacturers really upped their game when it came to the production and more efficient production, it meant that there were high quality vehicles coming into these markets in Europe and the USA, and complacent national car manufacturers in those markets, they had to respond to that threat from Asia. And of course, that made them re-examine their own processes, their own production, and they upped their game as a consequence. So competition worked very beautifully in that scenario. The consumer really won out then.